You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this episode of our series Let's Talk Sustainable Business, brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Today, I'm welcoming back David Hone, Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell. David joined Shell in 1980. He's a board member of the International Emissions Trading Association, and he's a board member of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions at Washington, USA. David posts regularly on his energy and climate change blog and has written a book on climate change, Putting the Genie Back. In our last episode, David explained us the methods of scenario planning, and he described their approach to create three Shell climate scenarios. Welcome back, David.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be here again.
Maybe we should just very briefly summarize what we talked about the last time.
Yeah, okay. So let me just quickly lay that out. So we talked about three new scenarios that we released in February of this year. They're called Waves, Islands, and Sky 1.5. And these three scenarios, built on our thinking around how the pandemic has changed livelihoods around the world, look at how the energy system might develop over the course of the coming decades, and look at specifically at how these different pathways do or don't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.
What I would suggest, Dave, that we briefly look at each of those scenarios and say what the basic assumption was and what the likely outcome is in terms of climate.
Okay, yes, we can do that. And the climate outcome is something that, related to each scenario, is something that we've worked on with MIT. So while Shell has a big energy modeling capacity in-house, we don't have a climate modeling capacity. And so we work with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, their joint program, and they remodel our scenarios to look at the climate impacts of our energy stories, and in particular, of course, temperature rise, but also some of the other impacts related to that.
So let's just take one by one. Maybe we start with the one that left me with a little light at the tunnel the last time we talked, the Sky 1.5.
Yeah, so Sky 1.5 is a scenario that emerges from a rethinking by society that their health and well-being is really very important. It comes as we come out of the pandemic. This becomes the sort of dominant thread through society, but also it's supported by the fact that the pandemic is a global problem, and it's only ultimately going to be solved by global cooperation. And so in this scenario, there's an increase in global cooperation as a result of the pandemic that puts in place the necessary linkages and coordination and cooperation necessary between countries to also resolve other problems, particularly the climate issue. And so the pandemic sort of lays the foundations for what I think in 2018, 2019 was sort of wishful thinking. Oh yeah, we'll suddenly all get together and we'll solve this problem. But in fact, the pandemic has forced us to get together, and in this scenario, forced us to get together in a very positive way. And so we come out of it with a new mindset around solving global problems, but driven by the fact that we've just had to solve a major global problem. So we're not quite there yet in terms of international cooperation, but think a couple of years down the track, and you're coming out of this with a new sense of purpose globally, and then that leads to a much faster resolution of changes required in the energy system to head towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, for instance, at the moment we've got a carbon price in Europe that's around 60 euros in the emissions trading system, and very few other places in the world have that. So you can imagine that over time that might cause more tension, because industries in Europe are going, well, look, we're exposed to something that others aren't exposed to. But in the Sky 1.5 scenario, you don't see those tensions emerging. You see other countries quickly looking at what the EU is doing and putting in place similar systems. And so everybody goes forward together. That's the important thing. And so what you see is that the energy system starts to change, and starts to change quite quickly. Emissions start to fall quite rapidly in the 2030s. By 2070, the energy system has reached net zero emissions. But in fact, globally, we reach net zero emissions before that, because part of this international cooperation leads to an end to deforestation, and in fact, large-scale reforestation to help adjust the carbon balance in the atmosphere. So we're globally at net zero emissions in the late 2050s, and this delivers by 2100 an outcome of around 1.5 degrees C.
I see. And the opposite scenario is the one where everybody looks after themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the island scenario, and this is I find this a slightly dystopian scenario. Some of my colleagues don't like that word, but it becomes quite an inwardly looking scenario. Nationalism is on the rise globally, led in put in part by the pandemic, because one way of addressing the pandemic is to sort of hunker down locally, lock yourself in, not work with others to solve the problem, and attend to your nation state. Yeah, and you can see elements of that in play today as well. Yeah. Countries do this for what they think are good reasons, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the best outcome. And so in this scenario, you see that become the more dominant theme. It leads to a slowing down of the global economy. It doesn't grow nearly as fast. It leads to poor outcomes in trade. It doesn't mean that nothing happens on the energy front, because individual countries or regions still pursue their own agendas. So they may shift rapidly in some parts of the world to new energy sources, but it doesn't happen as a global effort. And so in that scenario, by the end of the century, we're at around 2.5 degrees C of warming, and we're not quite done yet. Although emissions are falling, and you do in fact reach net zero emissions, in the first half of next century, you probably plateau around 2.6 or 2.7 degrees at the end of the day. And that's well above the goals of the Paris Agreement, and brings with it, of course, implications, of significant adaptation in the future.
Sea level rising and
well, exactly, yes.
More heat waves and stuff like that. Absolutely. So I guess the third scenario is then the middle ground.
Yeah, it is a type of middle ground. It's a middle ground in terms of temperature, but it's not a middle ground in terms of the energy system. It's the scenario is called waves, and it starts off. We come zooming out of the pandemic, or zoom's probably the wrong word to use in this day and age, but we come rushing out of the pandemic with this great desire to rebuild. We've put the pandemic behind us. Maybe it's because of the vaccination program, or because of a combination of vaccination with, recognition of how to track and trace, and all of these things come together. But we put the fear of COVID behind us. And it's all about rapid rebuilding and reestablishing economies. And so you get a surge in emissions in the early years, and a surge in energy demand. You get a surge in GDP. But the problems of issues like climate change and social issues like inequality, they're still there. And they re-emerge quite quickly. So by the late 2020s, you're starting to get a pushback. society's going, well, hang on, this is all very good. We've recovered from the pandemic, but we haven't addressed any of these problems, and they've got worse. And that leads to quite a knee-jerk reaction and a very rapid push away from fossil fuels. So whereas Sky is a concerted effort to reduce emissions, and you can reduce emissions, without necessarily moving away from fossil fuels completely, by using carbon capture and storage. In the wave scenario, it's just like, right, we're going somewhere else. We're going to do this differently. And so it heads off into a very specific direction of ending fossil fuel use. And so, technologies like hydrogen emerged very rapidly in the wave scenario, even faster than in the Sky 1.5 scenario. Because that's the technology, these are the technologies that can take you away from fossil fuels. Now, it doesn't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement because you've got this early surge in emissions and an early, and continued temperature rise. But by the end of the century, you're at net zero emissions. The temperature rise has plateaued at 2.3 degrees C, which is certainly above the goals of the Paris Agreement. But nevertheless, the climate problem or the climate issue has been resolved at a level. It's not the most desirable level, and that will still require adaptation going into or significant adaptation going into the 22nd century. But the fossil fuel era has pretty much come to an end by 2100.
When I listen to your three scenarios, there are two conclusions I draw from that. One is, regardless whether we're going to be first more inward looking or whether we're going to globally collaborate, or whether there is sort of first an urge to drive GDP and then recognition of what's going on, regardless of the three, climate emergency will catch up with us and require action. So regardless of which direction we take, eventually it will get to us. And that's the second conclusion I have from that, because basically they are linked to time scales when we start to act decisively, and that determines how much extreme weather events and stuff like that humanity will have to suffer.
Yeah, and I think the IPCC laid this out very clearly. There's more to come from the sixth assessment report, but we saw the first part of the report in August, and we certainly saw it in the 2018 report that limiting warming to this is where they made the case for 1.5, limiting warming to 1.5. No amount of warming is a good thing, but limiting to 1.5 was at least manageable. As you get to 2 and above, you start to have consequences that potentially mean significant change for society. And I think in this report that came out in August, they talked, for instance, about sea level rise beyond 2100. And whilst that won't impact the people who are alive today, it's a legacy that will be left. And they talked about sea level rise of potentially many meters. And only small shifts in temperature don't deliver centimeters of change, they deliver meters of change. But over a period of, it might be 500 years or something, but that is a legacy that others will have to deal with. And so I think that was the first time that the IPCC had really got into the nuts and bolts of that long-term legacy. So we talk about the climate emergency because it's imperative that emissions start to fall soon, or immediately actually. But in fact, the consequences of not doing this play out over the millennium, and they continue to play out.
I'm talking to someone who works at Shell, so I have to ask you, when you look at these conclusions, what does that mean for the oil and gas industry?
Well, I think it means that the oil and gas industry has to change, or the energy industry has to change, I should say. And the way it changes and the speed with which it changes is something that companies like Shell are thinking long and hard about. In all the scenarios, even in 2100 and into the 22nd century, there's still some use of fossil fuels. And in the wave scenario, it's relatively modest. It's mainly in the petrochemical sector. Our society today is physically built with carbon. Many of the goods and many of the products that we use start with, carbon chemistry, hydrocarbons. And all the plastics we use, many of the materials we use, many of the constructions materials, insulation, all of this comes out of carbon chemistry. And the obvious source of carbon is oil and gas. So, we're not going to have a society that's not using carbon. It's a question of where they get it from. Now, that society could get the carbon from the biosphere, either directly from the atmosphere, absorbing CO2, or from plants, making bioplastics and things. But that's requiring carbon for 8 to 10 billion people, and that's a very large scale impact on the biosphere. So no matter how we go forward, there are going to be impacts that we have to deal with, or changes that we have to deal with on a global scale. So anyway, the oil and gas industry will have to change. I think there's no doubt about that. I think Shell's very cognizant of that. We've talked about that in our strategy and our strategy day a few months back. But we're also here providing energy for, as one of many companies, for the 8 billion people that need it today.
Fair enough, but for example, people say maybe for mobility we don't need it to be carbon based.
No, it's certainly shifting to electricity. For a large chunk of the mobility services, it looks like electricity will be the mechanism. But you have to generate that electricity. So okay, we can generate that from renewables, from wind and from solar. But then equally, you have to build. If you look at the scenario, something like 1 million large wind turbines globally. Well, they're made of steel and they sit on cement foundations. All of those are manufactured with coal and natural gas, with limestone that when you turn it into cement releases CO2. So it's not just a question of generating the electricity. It's, our whole society has been built over the last 200 years on making use of fossil fuels to deliver the energy that we need and provide the carbon for the materials that we use in society. And that's not going to change all at once. It will change, and if you and I could be here in 100 years' time, I think it would be very different. But it's of those types of timescales that are necessary to completely turn over this system.
So let's come back to a point you just made: steel industry and also cement industry. Obviously, those both industries are looking into alternatives as well.
They are.
Have you considered that in the scenario?
Yes, I mean, for instance, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago that a consortium of European companies announced that they'd made the first production run, small production run of green steel. So this was steel that was manufactured through a hydrogen smelting process rather than a metallurgical coal process. And the chemistry behind that has been understood for a long time, but turning it into an industrial process is yet another step. Now, they've done the first production run from a relatively small plant. And I think the technology is very promising, and let's assume that the technology is adopted globally. Let's just make that assumption. And in fact, in the sky scenario, that's pretty much, and in the wave scenario, that's pretty much what happens. You've then got to rebuild or retool, hundreds of blast furnaces around the world. And we're still building blast furnaces using metallurgical coal as the proposed feedstock. So that takes time. They're not all going to change overnight. Because what has to happen in the real world is that first we run the pilot plant and we establish that the process is a viable process. And that's now happened. And it happened quite quickly, actually. But then one of these companies is going to have to make their first bold step and build a large-scale production facility that runs 24/7, that doesn't have any problems with hydrogen supply, all of the things associated with that. And so they're going to place a big commercial bet on that. And, let's assume that's successful. But are you going to have 50 companies around the world all simultaneously placing that same commercial bet? Many of them will say, yeah, we'll just watch and see what, XYZ steel company's doing. And if it's as successful as everybody thinks, we're in there. But, they may wait. And you can understand why they may wait, because there's still uncertainty. And also, they don't yet have secure long-term supplies of hydrogen, because the green hydrogen production chain, whilst it is getting going, it's not mainstream yet. It's producing hydrogen around the world in tiny quantities still. It's growing quickly, and Shell has just put in what soon won't be the world's largest electrolyzer, but was a few months ago, in a refinery in Germany to produce hydrogen. And I think I've already read that there's a company in China building a larger electrolyzer, which is good because it means that the technology is progressing rapidly. But then that takes time. And I think in our world energy model, we try and factor all that in. I know there's lots of people who just feel, oh, well, we should change from fossil fuels now to solve the climate issue. And everybody would like that to happen. But there's a real world out there that's ticking along.
Yeah, that's correct. And what your scenarios actually do, they install a sense of urgency. Yeah, because what we see that time is of the essence. And I completely accept that there are these scale-up problems. But on the other hand, I've just recently
I wouldn't
seen
call them problems. I just call them, it's the reality of the commercial reality of taking new processes and getting them and mainstreaming them. Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
No, I get that, and I accept that. But you see, I've just seen an article talking about the 10 biggest polluters in terms of carbon dioxide for electricity production. And it's just 10 plants that produce 80% of carbon dioxide by, for example, having the wrong type of coal and so on and so forth. And they're all coal-fired plants. So, sometimes we might be able to address that. And, my home country, Germany, has one of them. Poland has the biggest carbon dioxide producer, all based on coal. So if we just address those 10, we could already have a significant impact. So sometimes I think it is good to be bold in your ambitions as well.
Yes, I agree. And there's a number of examples of that around the world in different places. It's probably the case that, the 5 biggest blast furnaces in the world, and I don't know what scale they operate on, but it's probably the case that they're, the 5 or 10 biggest blast furnaces are half the emissions or something. And yeah, it's nice to say, oh, if only we could just change them. But, for all we know that those, 2 of those blast furnaces might be brand new, just started up. And they've had significant investment in them. So, are the owners going to want to tear them down again?
For sure not.
Well, and that comes back to this commercial reality.
Yeah.
So I just use that as an example. I don't know the details
No, no, of
the
course.
blast furnace industry, but it wouldn't
Yeah.
surprise me.
No, but the thing is, of course, as you said, collaboration is the essence here, and we have to see how these ambitions can be addressed, and I think what you've just said has implications not just for the oil and gas industry. How would you see that panning out for anybody else? How should they look at this, and how should they approach the insights from your scenarios if you're in any other industry?
Well, I think there's no industry that I can think of that is not dependent on oil, coal, and gas. Now, there's lots of companies that say, "Oh, we're only using renewable electricity," um, but that's their sort of immediate operations. But the fact is that they still have factories, and those factories are built with steel and cement, and that they're dependent on trucks to move their goods in and out of the factories, and the trucks are running on diesel, and the trucks run on roads and bridges that are made of cement and bitumen, which so they're not carbon neutral. They're sort of operationally carbon neutral, but again, they're embedded in the carbon society as much as anybody else, and so this impacts everybody in an equal way. We're all in this together. Um, and so every business is going to have to start to think about, what's in their supply chain and how do they change that, and how do they work with other parts of the supply chain in a sectoral type of approach to change things. I think it's nice to say, well, I just buy renewable electricity, therefore I'm out. I've done my bit, but in fact you haven't. You've done one small piece of your bit, and there's many other parts that you've got to put your mind towards.
That's the famous scope 3 discussion, of course, and so all the implications of what you do as a business down and up your supply chain. And
Correct. Yes.
I'm glad to say that more companies are recognizing this now. And I guess what you're saying to me, be aware of these impacts and do something about it. And I guess you guys are doing something about it as well.
Well, we are. I mean, Shell is working with its customers, with its customer base, with the supply chains to find ways of moving away from the fuels that they conventionally use. So, the aviation industry in our scenarios, they shift to hydrogen. And so you run aeroplanes on hydrogen. Well, you think about, it's not just about Shell producing hydrogen and turning up at, Heathrow or Schiphol and saying, well, there's hydrogen available, guys, use that. Because there's no aeroplane that currently burns it. Yeah. So we're going to have to work. So there has to be some sort of cooperation with Boeing or with Airbus. But then they don't actually make the engines. They're made by Pratt and Whitney and Rolls Royce. So, and then of course the airports themselves have to be ready. There's no point if an Airbus hydrogen plane turns up and Shell hasn't, or anybody else hasn't actually produced any hydrogen for it, nor does the airport actually have any facilities to hold hydrogen and refuel it. So these sectoral cooperation is going to be very important, I think, to get all this to work. I mean, that takes time. That you've got to build up those coalitions and get them to effectively make some big bets and go forward.
But you've just made, I think, a very important point in the sense that we can see all of this as a big threat to business, but we can also see it as huge opportunities to build new business models, new coalitions, new collaborations, and develop new solutions together. Right? I don't think anybody is, to go back to your scenario, an island in this anymore.
No, I agree. I think there is huge opportunity, and you only have to look at what's happened in the digital world in the last 20 years to look at the opportunities. I mean, companies like Blockbuster and Kodak, I guess, come to mind, and everyone thinks, oh yeah, well they didn't see it, But in fact, the number of companies that have emerged, who would have imagined Netflix and all the other companies replacing Blockbuster? And the fact that every year we take, I think there's some astounding number that every few months we take more photographs than have ever been taken in history. So that imaging industry has transformed itself and is enormous today compared to the days of silver halide photography, which of course was Kodak. So yeah, I think opportunity abounds, and it's for Shell, it's finding that opportunity and making the most of it.
Absolutely. And by the way, to our audience, all the details of the 3 scenarios can be found on the Shell website if you want to dive a bit deeper into what we could only scratch the surface. David, I would like to thank you so much for enlightening us about scenario planning and the implications on climate change. And unfortunately, we weren't able to really dive deep into any of those subjects. But for the audience, if you're interested, you find more information on the TCB website and also on the Shell website. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much for inviting me today.
To the audience, if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or to explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcast. We would really appreciate feedback and suggestions for subjects to cover by email sent to sustainability@tcb.org. Thank you for listening, and please join us again. Goodbye for now.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.